The next thing we're going to do is determine the semantic range of the word destroy. And so remember we said that a word has multiple meanings, or it can be used in multiple ways. Well, it's time to figure out what all of our options are as far as the word destroy. What I'm going to do is right click here, destroy, and I'm going to go to a lexicon. I've got a lot of different options here. I'm just going to randomly pick, let's do probably this. And we get a really basic definition here. It can mean to destroy, it can mean to harm, or it can mean to deprave. These are what are called semantic ranges. Now within each one of these, if we click on it, it takes us to a longer example with a longer definition with an example of how it's used. Now in this case, I just randomly ended up clicking on a definition that cites the passage we're looking at as the example. So this lexicon seems to think that really what's happening here is the word is being used to say ruin or destroy, with the implication of causing something to be corrupt or thus cease to exist. So anyway, that's one view there. We're going to look at another lexicon. It's good to look at a few here. Obviously, if you don't know Greek, this might be a little more confusing, but with Bible software, it's pretty easy. Phthero here tells us that it can have the sense of to ruin or destroy in a relation outward circumstances like ruin, corrupt, cause harm to. It could also be a moral or corruption or religious corruption, to mislead. And they cite 2 Corinthians 7:2 here. To be depraved is another option, or internal punishment. Now these guys too seem to think it is a complete destruction, and they're willing to say that in 3:17, and that on our passage it is complete eternal destruction. So if Paul is referring to Christians in 3:17, the most common way to understand this is that Christians can be eternally destroyed if they do things bad enough. So we have that lexicon, and so I think we've got an idea of the possible use here. It can mean ruin or destroyed. It can mean corrupt, harm. It could be corrupt or depraved. Good. So let's close this out. The next thing to do is ask ourselves, how does Paul use it in the same passage? Now, since I'm using Bible software, I'm just going to right click on it and do a Bible word study. I'm using Logos 4, so this is going to just pop out real quick. And this word in the New Testament only occurs 8 in 8 verses, only 9 times. So I'm going to see I want to see a list of all the times this word appears. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by looking to see how Paul uses this word and what he means by that. Remember we said when we look at when we're trying to determine the semantic range, first we look at the lexicon, and then we see how the author uses it in that same passage. Then we ask ourselves, how does that same author use it in that letter? And then how does that author use it in all his letters? And then we ask ourselves, well, how do other New Testament writers use it? And then finally we can even search to see how other Greek writers like Josephus or Philo use it. So let's start by looking at the usage in 1 Corinthians. What's interesting is that this word is used twice in that same verse. We might have missed it in English, but he says, if any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. So the question we could ask ourselves is, oh, that's interesting. Well, not only are we asking what does it mean that God will destroy him, but now we can ask ourselves, what does it mean that a man destroys the temple of God? Because it's the same word. So maybe Paul is using the same word twice. He could also be using it differently. So that's a good question. Now, we know from context that Paul is talking about leaders who are dividing the body. And if we were to look at our passage here, he says he's using this illustration of a master builder who's building on the foundation of Jesus Christ. And so it could be that as Christian leaders are building on the temple of God, that some are actually destroying the temple of God. They're tearing it apart or dividing it. And so if any man is undoing the work of them, or is ruining the work or destroying the temple of God, God will destroy him. So it could have this sense of destruction as opposed to building up, and possibly here destruction as opposed to building up. Now, if that is the sense it has, then it may not be complete utter destruction. It might be something like undoing or ruin. In the same way, destroying the temple means kind of like ruining more than it means obliteration or eternal destruction. So that's kind of an interesting thought here. Now, I'm going to point out something that one of my students pointed out, that it could destroy, could have the connotation of corrupt morally. If any man morally corrupts the temple of God, God could destroy him. And so in that sense, he's using the same word twice, but he's using different definitions in each. I don't really see that happening, but that is a possibility here. Let's look at how else it's used in 1 Corinthians. In 15, we've got here 1 Corinthians 15:33. Don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Now here we see that moral corruption, right? I just mentioned that one of my students pointed out this could mean moral corruption. That is used in this way here in 1 Corinthians 15:33. So that would be a support there. Of course, that would lead us with the question is, well then, what does Paul mean for it here in the second instance of 1 Corinthians 3:17? Could Paul be saying, if a man corrupts or morally corrupts the temple of God, God will morally corrupt him? It's possible we'd have to think about it, but that usage is shown here in 15:33. Now let's look at how Paul uses it outside of 1 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians 7:2, Paul says, make room for our hearts. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one. So here corrupted probably doesn't mean morally ruined. What probably Paul is saying is he didn't, it's not a moral issue. He's saying he didn't wrong anybody. He didn't take advantage of anybody. He's probably saying I didn't cause harm to anyone. So in 2 Corinthians 7:2, I'm going to go ahead and think that probably means harm. Of course, we're not looking at it in context at this point, but if we were going to be real thorough, we could do that. So anyway, you would do that through all of these passages and get an idea. Now I've already done that, so I kind of have a sense of what theta means. That it primarily means destruction, but it also has a sense of ruining and then moral corruption. So that's how we determine the semantic range.